Thank you so much for having me. I want to make sure everyone can hear me okay and so forth. It's all good? Great. Wonderful.
Great. Thank you.
So I want to start by saying I hope, there's two versions of any AI talk in today's world. One is the scary version, and one is the happy, optimistic, all rainbows and unicorns version. I can't really do rainbows and unicorns with the responsible use of technology in era of generative AI. But I, what I would hope to do in the next 40 or so minutes that I've prepared, and then I hope we can have a good discussion, is I want to just give state of the discourse around the responsible use of generative AI in research. And I took this occasion sort of to do like a literature survey for myself. And, I'll sort of want to share some of the best practices that I've uncovered. So, what is the state of AI? Already, I think as we speak, the development of these models and developments in technology have been so rapid. There is a new large language model every day. There's, I think Chat GPT, we had 3.54, then some 4.0. Maybe tomorrow there'll be something else. Things have become multimodal. The the state of capabilities, especially in this generative AI space, are truly mind boggling. In just 2 years, we've seen that abstracts, in one study, abstracts written by Chat GPT are fooling scientists. In sense that there was a group of researchers generated set of abstracts that were written by Chat GPT and then took abstracts from real published papers in scientific journals. And I think that if we recruited biologists and people from different domains, they were able to tell accurately what was human created content only maybe like 60% of the time or something like that, which should be concerning to all of us. We can see that Claude, uh, their the state of the art capabilities are kind of very difficult to grasp because we are now in an era where the Turing test is already passé. A lot of other tests that have been designed uh, to tell the difference between human intelligence versus machine intelligence. There's also, those benchmarks have been met as well. The large language models are trained to break those kinds of narrow tests, I should point out. So, what does this mean for us, all of us in research? And what does this mean more broadly for those of us in the education space about distinguishing between what is human created content and what's an AI generated artifact? I think that's where we are today. How do we protect research integrity when it's so hard to tell? Um, there, you know, what what are sort of best practice solutions? Are we in a position where we can say we can't use AI? My argument is we cannot say we can't have blanket rules like I will not use any AI for the simple reason that it's so hard to distinguish between what's AI generated and human generated. Somebody may very well, if you in the classroom, if you say I don't want an AI generated essay, somebody can very well bring in an AI generated essay and we will not be able to tell the difference. So I think that's where I want to start by prefacing my remark with that. Of course, that doesn't mean AI can do everything. AI is still not very good at reasoning or spatial reasoning or complex reasoning. There's many things that AI cannot do, but there is certain level of capabilities, the automation of what formerly we used to think of as cognitive tasks, automation of things that approach empathy in things like chatbots, automation of capabilities where instead of doing stuff in the lab, we could go to chat GPT and create like essentially a lab experiment and run, or we can create synthetic data using AI. And all these have enormous implications for us as researchers and how we engage in responsible conduct of research. So, I, along with some colleagues, we wrote, I think, this editorial on essentially the two faced effect of generative AI. So this is published in one of our top journals in my field. So I've kind of taken the position, along with some other colleagues, that we cannot really say, we cannot get away from AI and say, I'm not going to use AI. I think increasingly human creativity is becoming increasingly interdependent with AI. And for so goes for research. And how do we navigate those boundaries? What is very sobering, I want to give this example from Ethan Mollick, who's a professor at the Wharton School of Business. He's been sort of almost, he's been at the forefront of highlighting some of the emerging capabilities of generative AI technologies. So this was an example from his Twitter. I think that this one is Chat GPT with code interpreter, and this is already example is more than a year old. It generated an academic paper. You can just input a data set and it will generate an academic paper, right? It's not a blockbuster. It's not going to be published in our top journal, but it's maybe meets the bar for a smaller workshop. I don't know. Have we tested this out? Again, how have we tested this thing where you are an author, you submit a paper to a journal, and then you do get a referee report that looks like it's generated by AI? We are hearing of those kinds of examples, anecdotal again, but anecdotes do add up. And again, there are all kinds of stories about, we do hear about these. There was a famous, I think, famous in sense, famous on social media, which went viral. I didn't post that in my slides, but clearly someone asked ChatGPT to write the introduction. And then this paper gets published in an Elsevier journal that has an impact factor of like 6 or something like that, 5. With the first line in the introduction is, certainly, here is here is a paragraph for you. So in other words, one of the authors went to ChatGPT, asked it to generate an introduction and just copy pasted it without any guardrails. And somehow it went through the review process and got published. It was there in the published work. Nobody spotted this. And I think these kind of examples are sobering indicators that we need to be very, very careful in putting these boundaries between. And I can already see a lot of questions and comments. Some folks are talking about this is not ethical. As someone who's in a business school, I would say that the question really is, how do we enforce or how do we set boundaries around behavior and say that this is acceptable, this is not acceptable? The reason is, I think that research and some of the disclosures has shown that if we voluntarily ask people to sign a disclosure, well, sometimes it's effective, sometimes there's a lot of fine print. So I'm not wading into all those ethical issues, just merely pointing out that all these problems exist. So just a small segue into large language models. What are large language models? Well, you have large corpus of data, and then you mask it, and then you sort of make it into, it's essentially a very large scale prediction, sequence prediction kind of a problem. And the data tokens, GPT-3 training data has been on billions of tokens. So it's truly mind-boggling how big the data sets are. And what is also interesting is the number of parameters on which they're tuned. Now we're talking about billions of parameters. So it's very hard to comprehend for us as individuals the sheer complexity and size of this kind of very multi-scale prediction that is going on behind the hood, as it were, of these large language models. Of course, since they're essentially predicting text from text or image from image or unstructured data, you can have a lot of problems. One well-known problem is that of hallucinations. Another is that they're not really symbolic, neurosymbolic AI. This is just kind of very large-scale predictive AI. So how do we understand these effects and these inputs, and what does that mean for us as researchers? Right? So the big revolution in this space has been there was a paper published in 2017 from Google Research called Attention is All You Need. So in 2017, so it's just 7 years old, this entire field. There was a specific kind of network architecture. It's like a feed forward network, if you will, but based on a mechanism called attention. And that's later on, if you do what, we used to do what is called multitask learning. Then we have these attention and transformers. And we have later on prompting and what's called chain of thought prompting, zero shot learning, all the thing. Essentially, I think last 5 years has, it's almost like, the meteor struck the earth. You had like those dinosaurs. So advanced AI capabilities almost seem like that, almost mysterious, magical in some sense. The amount of things we are able to do now is truly mind boggling. So, what can all these large language models do? We've gone beyond large language models. We are building what are called foundation models, very large general purpose models trained out of huge amounts of data. And the big thing in current generations is of AI is that they're not specifically trained for one task. Earlier generations of models were trained to do one thing. Expert systems at some point in the 80s were about we'll take a lot of rules and codify them. Now we are not talking about codifying rules. We are just kind of throwing a lot of data, and we have very fancy ways of getting it's like self-teaching itself. These transformer mechanisms and this kind of very large scale tokens, and you create this kind of enormous prediction machine. It's teaching itself something. What is it precisely teaching itself? Can we put some sort of interpretability on top of it? We could. Can we give a little bit more understanding to individuals about what all this data is being taken? How are we training the AI? What part of these neural networks, what are the inputs and outputs? Once again, we can add some layer of interpretability and intuition. I think even companies like Amazon have to deal with these kinds of issues. There are ways to make it more manageable, more understandable, and so forth. There's also issues of copyright. The companies like OpenAI are arguing that it's not really that they would like to make the claim that they're just taking all this data and sort of, essentially blurring or masking the relationship between all these inputs. It's just a lot of training data, right? So they don't want us to believe that they are intentionally plagiarizing. So that's a huge question, which I will leave to the experts in copyright. But what is the AI learning? How is it learning? We still are, we're kind of throwing darts into the dark, as it were, right? We've just built all these fancy prediction machines. When we say we collectively as a society, actually a small group of private individuals have done it. And we are all, I think, dealing with the aftermath of what a few people in companies like OpenAI and Google Research have done, and Claude and all those other folks have done. So large language models can do summarization, classification, understanding, editing, coding. They're constantly evolving and improving. We have foundation models, as I said, which can do enormously great things just by virtue of the fact that they're trained on very large amounts of data. They're very general purpose. So, one way to describe it is in philosophy, there's this emergence. An ability is emergent if it's not present in smaller models, but it's present in the larger models. So you just take this huge amount of data and then you train it in some fancy method. And all of a sudden, what this can do is you can put a script into ChatGPT, script of a movie, and ChatGPT can classify it as, is this a comedy? Is this a tragedy? Is this, or it can connect it to other things. It can interpret, right? So all that was not, we did not train it on these specific abilities. It sort of learned itself, and it's a sequence prediction problem. And you suddenly see a lot of emerging abilities. And that could be a great thing, but it can also it can also be, it can also pose a lot of new challenges for us, especially in research, because what we have learned to do that as researchers is that kind of close reading of text. We are reading very deeply and closely, and we interpret the world through our training. And suddenly, what we have is we have this kind of AI's ability to take all this enormous amounts of information and generate a lot of sometimes plausible, sometimes implausible things. And does that somehow interfere with our training as scholars? That's, I think, the larger question. I don't really have any clear answer. Right. So, just very simple examples. Large language models just take those emojis and interpret it as this is describing the movie Finding Nemo, right? Just that ability, that itself is a very, in a nutshell, it is surprising because 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we didn't think this was possible, right? Large language models are increasingly, you can think of them as being creative. There's enormous number of, there's a lot of startups, folks using these large language models to generate business plans, to automate uh, everything from voice actors to advertising campaigns. We're seeing lots of these kinds of generate new product ideas, generate even things for experiments and so forth. And yes, you can uh, give ideas for anything from entrepreneurship to market research to design to financial trading. The range of possibilities is truly, either it can be scary or it can be awe inspiring, or some people are also would argue that what you have is a regression to the mean. There's a lot of training data, and all the large language models are being trained on the same training data. Does that create a thing where we essentially don't have a good way of distinguishing between high quality inputs versus low quality inputs? That's a third stream of thought, right? So once again, all these are possibilities. We are still very much at the beginning of this kind of a process, right? So this is one example where easy to give business examples for me since I'm in a business school, but you could think of, the recent the Nobel Prize in medicine, the Nobel Prize in physics, especially medicine, the deep medicine, Dennis Hammerbiss and others, using these complex networks to synthesize protein structures. You can use these complex methods to discover new associations, to identify interactions between drugs, right? The example I have is one where you can come up with a product idea, you can come up with a marketing plan, you can come up with a new logo using stable diffusion. So you can write the part of the code using ChatGPT, right? So all you need is a person generating a lot of prompt with a lot of prompt engineering, and you have voila, new company, right? You just have to take it to maybe a venture capitalist and commercialize it. And so it's really interesting that the state of things that we are in. And once again, when we talk about prompts, there is obviously some level of prompt engineering. It's like, what is the right way we are working with AI? But if all we are doing as human beings is to write better prompts, that doesn't sound so great, right? Like, what is the value of our tacit knowledge and all the information that we carry inside us of all our social connections? It cannot be just reduced to, oh, I can write better prompt than the next person. And so I think the same applies in a research setting. What is the value of me spending so many years being like this interdisciplinary researcher, having this built all these connections across different fields and ability to do field research? How does all that change with these kind of generative AI models? And how do the journals and funding agencies also understand what is the premium? And at a very simple level, how can we ensure that people are not just taking something and just automating it using AI? And there's something more. So, of course, uh, immediately examples in creative industries, there is a lot of questions around what are the skills of the future, right? We could have AI for writing assistance, code generation, image generation, there can be copywriting. So at the very minimum, we could talk about use of generative AI tools as kind of aid to composition, or at least they can automate parts of literature reviews, or aggregating things, or even comparing. If you have multiple authors writing a paper, making sure paper reads consistent. Some folks use chat gpt to do those kinds of automate those kinds of tasks, right? So we've gone beyond now to foundation models, and it's essentially the level of complexity and the the whole sort of applications that can be possible, from everything from image, in medicine, people using all these large language models to diagnose diseases, or using complex models in transportation for planning purposes, route planning, optimization. It's just truly incredible to think of all the possible applications, from every field, from engineering to sciences to business to arts. There's just seems like every day there is a new foundation model. Actually, every day there's like 5 new foundation models. So what does it all mean for us in academia? How do we engage with these in a responsible manner, right? So of course there's a lot of opportunities where we can um, you know the medical question answering benchmarks. I thought this is really interesting how the large language models can do very well on even consumer medical question answering, for example. So you can compare automated versus human evaluation. And like I said, it's almost like instead of a doctor who has uh, however rich insights they have, they don't have all the knowledge of the world available at their fingertips. Maybe this kind of super intelligent AI has some of those kinds of capabilities. And what's the best way for humans and AI to work together, right? But of course, there are a lot of challenges we have to deal with. One is where are these models? How are they built? There is a lot of bias that comes in these models from the data that has been used to build them. For example, this is something that went viral. If we're taking even static representations of the world from newspaper clippings, in the newspaper clippings, there may be an association between some ethnicities and crime. So, for example, some ethnicity A is frequently mentioned in connection with, oh, crime at the border or something like that, right? And then what happens if you're picking up this association implicitly between ethnicity A and something undesirable? Then, if you're training a model of the world based on those associations and you're using it to predict restaurant recommendations, then your AI is teaching itself that some words are good words, like Italian, and some words are bad words, right? Of course, there are solutions, and solutions do exist for large language models too. So there have been lots of studies that have documented biases such as gender bias, ethnicity bias, etc., in use of large language models, right? This is a very simple example. This is if you go to stable diffusion image generators are even worse than large language models. You put a prompt like CEO, Chief Executive Officer. What is it? Do you notice anything common to all these images? Well, they're all wearing suits, but there's also something else, right? All of them happen to be
Yeah.
male.
Yeah.
And where do you
Okay.
get these biases come from? The training data? World is biased place, but we are picking up those biases and they can be magnified in our data. And when we use some of these for research, is there certain fields may be underrepresented, certain things are overrepresented in our training data sets? There is also a sort of implicitly an ethnocentric, some parts of the world, a lot of training data is coming primarily from North America or Europe. So how does that affect scholars in other parts of the world? Do we have to be aware of all these biases and so forth, right? Again, we have to be, again, lots of, and then hallucinations. Because generative AI is ultimately what it is. It's a very complex prediction sequence. How do we ensure that these outputs are actually correct? Generative AI can also generate a lot of things that are not true. So, 2 years ago, when ChatGPT first came, a friend of mine who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, he went into this experiment where said, write a bio for Professor Anjana Susarla. And ChatGPT, this was 2 years back, generated this bio where it's like said, I got my PhD from MIT and then I'm expert in human computer interaction. Neither of those happen to be true, right? So, and of course, I'm professor at Georgia Tech. My colleagues will be a bit surprised to know that I'm have two jobs, or I'm two persons or something like that. So you can generate all kinds of, and this is something for us to be, where is the human intervention? What is the level of supervision required when we are working with generative AI outputs, right? Solutions do exist. I think we talk about what's called retrieval augmented generation, very large scale. We can do fact checking and so forth, but those solutions are not costless, right? So, in other words, there are wonderful promises of generative AI, but there's also, we have to be aware of essentially what's going on, right? And this is very interesting. I don't have time to play this audio clip, but a week or so back, a reporter interviewed me for Scientific American, and what she did was really interesting. Took one of my publicly available working paper, which I had posted on a working paper repository. This is not published paper, full disclosure. And then she put it through one of the latest tools. It's called, from Google, it's called Notebook LM. Notebook LM is the tool. What does the tool do? Maybe I can play
All right,
like
listeners,
1 minute.
Ready to dive deep into AI and creativity?
Let's do it.
Today, we're looking at how those large language models, like ChatGPT,
Right?
are impacting writers and creative writing.
Yeah.
We found this super dense academic research paper.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to break it down for you.
Absolutely.
No jargon, I
It's hard.
promise.
It's going to be good.
So one of the things that I found really interesting is that they actually frame these LLMs as co-authors in the creative process.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like ChatGPT is a co-author.
Okay, so co-author. Now,
I'll stop here. This is what Notebook LM does. It takes academic papers or anything else, any documents you put in, creates a podcast out of it. So there's a male and a female. And, there's
all right,
something.
listeners.
Sorry.
Ready?
So what are some serious issues here? I read it. The reporter actually asked me, here is what I did. And here is your paper, and here's the audio. What do you think of it? I had to say, some of it was really awe-inspiring, right? It is very coherent. It can take my paper and situate it in fantastically in terms of connecting it to other papers that have been published. But does it make, in my own work, I didn't see errors. But the reporter actually pointed some issues where maybe it's making incorrect inferences, right? It also incorporates very human sounding linguistic and conversational features. So, is this misrepresentation? Does this kind of thing wipe out certain types of discourse and privilege a certain viewpoint? I don't have the answers. In fact, what I mentioned to the reporter is that for us to evaluate all these, we would need very large scale audit studies, right? This is just a very new tool. It's been developed by Google. It sounds incredible. It offers a lot of promise. For us as academics to really think about, is this tool, does this really do a lot of things that scholarly research is supposed to do or synthesize in a manner that a scholar does? We would need to spend a lot of time. A lot of people have to spend a lot of time evaluating. And I think that's the problem with some of the current generation of AI tools, right? It's like the technologies kind of have outpaced our ability to understand and put it in context of what we already know in our research field, because there's a lot of obviously, a lot of advances have been concentrated in this kind of language models and images and some of those specific inputs that we intersects with creative and scholarly pursuits, and we haven't thought through all the risks and guardrails in that process. So some questions, I think, what should institutions think about? We need a lot of discipline specific and institution specific policies, because as I said with the notebook LM, it's just me as a person. Immediately, one thing I can think of is we need a lot more audit studies before we can actually use this as a tool, as a guide for field studies, or if you want to use this in medicine, where we want to use notebook LM to create some kind of a conversational agent that can assist patients or that can assist doctors. Well, we would need to think more about all the kinds of guardrails that are necessary, and those are discipline specific. There's also institution specific. We need a lot more transparency and disclosure at a very minimum. Again, people will use AI as long as this AI offers the promise of it can easily automate things. Our students are probably going to use it. So at least at a very minimum, we need transparency and disclosure norms. And I think that's already in some form, we are seeing that across a lot of uses. And I'm seeing some incredibly, very, very wonderful messages in the chat. So obviously our audience is fully aware of all the issues that, I'm trying to highlight, right? What else? How do we, our institutions, I think, as I said, we have to be aware of bias, we have to be aware of hallucinations, we have to be aware that large scale auditing of these things has not been done. But I think one very interesting concept I learned is this generalization issue with generative AI, which is that I'll talk about that a little bit in more detail. But it's also the case that you're taking some tool that is built with a certain data sets or some data that's been scraped off all these websites. I think a Washington Post did this kind of study in collaboration with some AI researchers about the provenance of this data. Where is ChatGPT's data coming from? Some of it is Wikipedia, some it's from Reddit, some will be all these essays that people publish on the internet. Some of it was just this racist neo-Nazi sites. So it's all over the place, right? And what does that mean when we take some of these things and use it in our research? Is there some boundaries that we should be aware of? And how do we generalize these the findings from like an AI tool? Does that really work well outside the sample? Those are all issues we should be worried about, right? So the pitfalls, this was something in my own work I've tried to argue, is that we have to worry about institutionalizing human biases, right? Or maybe how interpretable. This is just still a black box model. We don't know what it means to take a generative AI. So there's no substitute for independent knowledge, for depth of critical thinking, for engagement, deep engagement with issues. There's no substitute for us as scholars being aware of the implications of our work. And, that sort of responsible, it's incumbent on all of us to have that kind of human primacy. We retain decision right over key elements of our research. Maybe you're still working with generative AI, but it has to be the primacy of human research. We cannot understate it. And this was a very interesting in NPJ Digital Medicine article that was published. I thought what it also talks about is, from an ethics perspective, we are taking these AI systems and extrapolating knowledge from one part of one phenomena, one part of the world to other things, right? I think we have to be aware of those generalization biases as well, right? Especially in the field of medicine, but it can be in other like psychology and any things where, it's there's some sensitivity aspect of you're taking decisions, you're taking research that affects people, and it can affect people differently in a different setting, and one has to be very careful. So the generalization challenge is almost one where we take data that could be maybe unrepresentative. We don't know how representative. We are not looking at all these issues when we're using generative AI. And then when we are building these AI models, is there some kind of, are we excluding, are we not looking at unfamiliar or challenging samples? How do we kind of incorporate a less biased perspective into our use of these tools? Right. So I think we need best awareness of model deployment and essentially some kind of anomalies. What are things that will fail, or what are applications where generative AI is not really a good tool to use? And think that that boundary is something very important for us to understand, right? So what I thought was really interesting is the European Research Area Forum has some really nice guidelines on the responsible use of generative AI in research. And I thought that, some of them were really fantastic. So they talk about essentially, I'm sorry, there's some typos here, which I forgot to uh, look at. So we need a critical approach, right? And we should be very self-aware of the bias, hallucinations, and inaccuracies. Also, we cannot impute any authorship or co-authorship to AI. It's the human being who is ultimately working with AI, and to that extent, the agency and responsibility is solely with the people doing the research and not, the AI, right? So we have to also be very careful with this generative AI in the scientific process. Are we using some material, and then it's, how do we make sure we are not altering or manipulating original research data or falsifying? I think this is something, the provenance of the data and how generative AI is kind of using these methods of, altering the original data. I think one has to be very, very careful. This is, I think, my caveat to, if you're using generative AI as a substitute for doing an experiment in a lab, then we have to have an extra layer of scrutiny to those things, just because of the potential where generative AI can be maybe almost, taking original sources. It's trained on some original data, and should we do a little bit of more audit is required on the outputs of the generative AI? So that's something we need to be careful about. And we have to be very transparent. We need to make sure what are the input and the prompts should be available to as an appendix if necessary. And we should take into account the fact that this is a stochastic process, right? It produces different output from the same input. It's not fixed. Every time you put a prompt doesn't mean you will get necessarily the same thing, right? We care a lot about reproducibility and robustness. So we have to be very clear. We have to adopt these mitigation methods, and also privacy and confidentiality and intellectual property rights issues should be very, very important as well, right? And we have to be very mindful that any generated data can be used for other purposes. So when we are interacting with generative AI tools, are we giving away our domain specific knowledge that OpenAI can then use in training their models? And this is something that comes up in the industry context as well, because every prompt that you put is training data, unless the company specifically you're opting out and there's some disclosures. But we have to be aware that we are doing no, right? Are we intentionally doing something or unintentionally? And then there's a lot of adversarial gaming in the generative AI world. With the prompts, any tools that we are using can also be vulnerable to manipulation. I know that I've seen research where generative AI has been used as a tool for persuasion, but that can work essentially both ways. So again, as I said, large scale audit is required before we can make any conclusive things about, oh, generative AI is great for X or great for Y. We don't quite know, because this is really just 2 years old, this entire development. And I think we're drowning in a deluge of all these generative AI models. And maybe there are not enough of us as researchers trying to evaluate all these capabilities and put them in the context, right? So we should be also very careful about the potential for plagiarism, because the output of generative AI is maybe it's based on someone else's results. Are we just taking results from someone using without attribution? As academics, we are very careful about citation and proper attribution. So this is something that we should be careful about as well, right? So we do have to be, very careful about these unfair treatments like hallucinations, biases, and so forth, right? How do we safeguard original work of fellow researchers? I think that's like the most important thing. So I like these European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity talks about all these reliability and honesty and respect for other cultures, traditions, research participants, and just the accountability where every step of the way we have some transparency and guidelines. Right. So this is also wonderful. There was editorial in PNAS on protecting scientific integrity in age of generative AI. I think some closing thoughts I will offer is they also outlined, the researchers outlined 5 principles, which is just transparent disclosure and attribution, and some verification, independent verification of AI generated content and analysis, documentation of AI generated data. We have to be very careful to document. We need focus on ethics and equity when we are using all these AI generated image. And finally, it requires continuous monitoring and public engagement for us, that we are constantly aware that using these tools carries some level of risks in them. And maybe that's true of any other research methods as well. End of the day, this is one more scientific tool that's available, but we have to have that a continuous monitoring mindset, right? These are rapidly evolving, so we need to be cognizant of the dynamics of use in the scientific endeavors and so forth. So this is kind of, I think I was told to leave about 15 minutes for discussion. So I've kept that time target, and that's kind of, what I've prepared so far. So yeah, I think that Chris, I'm just now
Thank you so much, Professor Susarla. You did a great job of highlighting our issues, but leaving us with some good news about where we could go. And I think you've been seeing the chat. There's been a lot of discussion about AI around healthcare. So maybe from your perspective, you'd like to share your thoughts in that to, you probably glanced at the comments. That was kind of a general one. And then we do actually have some notes about LLMs and proprietary LLMs within institutions. So I'll let you share your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think that, someone asked me about student runs output of AI and plagiarism detector and pass. Are they okay? I'm not entirely sure, in the sense that what is the plagiarism detector trained on? See, one problem for plagiarism detectors is they are also more biased. They're, the studies have shown that they are actually biased against non-native speakers and so forth. So are we, what are we, there's some different set of challenges when we're running things to plagiarism. That's all I want to say, right? I won't.
I would say, as a research integrity officer, they are okay is not true. I mean, it's still ultimately falsified or fabricated. I mean, to say would they be caught? Perhaps not, but I think it's kind of a different question. It depends on context. This is essentially fabrication then, but sorry. Yeah, I like that comment that's just there because I think, well, anyway, we're segueing off of your thoughts.
Yeah. One question is internal LLM does not share prompts outside of the institution. Yes, I think that is true. To some extent, you know, using ChatGPT is one thing, but using large language model trained on domain specific data and run internally is very different. So to that extent, I have to say that yes, that comment is certainly true, right? So there is I think that some of these ones are talking about how to de-identify data you can share without violating HIPAA. I think that tools like Notebook LM, for instance, we can use it with de-identified data. Notebook LM supposedly trains the model using local data inputs. So there is kind of a balance between this large transformer based, very large scale architecture, which associates things from very large scale data, but then we can still train it for a smaller data set using proprietary data. So I think there's various ways of like fine tuning or local training or de-identifying. Obviously, lots and lots of methods are available. So I would not want to put a very blanket, using ChatGPT is one thing, and using more responsibly large language models built for a particular, I would say, like a BioBot used in biomedical fields. That is very different from, let's say, using ChatGPT. So I would, caution folks against, yes, I try to give some sort of scary examples, but doesn't mean that blanket all large language models have problems or something like that. I think we definitely need more maybe discipline specific and institution specific practices, best practices, and more knowledge also, sort of like a repository of how do we use these tools in the best possible manner to help us be better researchers and in acting with ethical manner and safeguarding research integrity. There's a lot that can be done as well, right? So I think that internal, yes, there was an example we're talking about a medical system has a LLM that's internal and compliant. Yes, that sounds like a wonderful sort of there's work to dictate nurse talk during patient into patient's chart. Yes, I think that this kind of methods may not even need large language models, or maybe we can use some large language models in responsible manner, right? It's more like identifying like large language models in that patient context provided here would be application would be to detect drugs, or it can be to detect symptoms, or it can be to detect diseases. I've done a little bit of that with social media data, and those are very, very good with respect to predictive accuracy. So those can be all great.
Craig, did you have a follow-on question? I saw your hand up.
Yes.
I was just going to say there was a nice question in the chat box. It's a little bit further up. It reads, you mentioned that institutions need policies to support the responsible use of AI. Have you found any examples that you like, or do you know of any institutions that are doing this well right now?
Do I see folks who are doing, I would say, the very good examples I've seen, I've tried to give a few. I think our institution, MSU, has some nice guidelines about responsible AI, responsible use of these technologies. And I was in one of those discussions myself. So obviously, I can't advocate for sort of my own work that I've done, but I feel that a lot of institutions, I saw some nice guidelines posted at University of Illinois website. Just quickly looking through, I found some very nice examples. And I think a lot of thoughtful folks are, spending a lot of time and effort thinking through these problems. So I can't, top of my head, I can't say this is the best example. That's why I gave the EU guidelines as like, sort of bigger than one institution. Those are very, seem like really something that we can all learn a lot from that example.
And I think, I'm an RCR instructor at our institution. The students are using it, and they come up to me and ask, "Is it okay to use this in my dissertation?" And I always, and maybe you could share your thoughts. It's kind of a segue to a question in there about what's the best use of AI in research, where a lot of students that are non-native English speakers talk about how it helps them improve syntax and is that allowed? And I said, ultimately ask your advisor. And I said, there's a big difference. Like, I'm a terrible speller. There's a big difference between learning and improving your language and then using it as a crutch to do it for you. So perhaps that's a segue to a question we have here is how useful is generative AI really, and what's the best use for it in research? And I'll just add one, I think for non-native English speakers, it is very good for language, improving the language. Hopefully it also builds their capability as well. But I'd invite your thoughts.
I've heard people say that it's, for non-native speaker, it's good. I would not consider myself a non-native speaker, full disclosure, because, I grew up in India. I spoke English from the time I was like 2 years old. So I'm practically native speaker. So with maybe an Indian accent and Indian form of English. How good is generative AI? I think it does a good job of standardizing some English. That is good. If you are unfamiliar with the language, some amount of standardized syntax is a good thing. But you could be someone like me who has influenced by some sort of a British version of English that came through the Indian system. And then maybe generative AI is not so great for you, right? But it's definitely good if someone was learned English much later as an adult, and then of course it's a good tool to have. Leaving aside the native, non-native, what generative AI does very well is it at least provides a level of standardization of certain things, right? Interestingly, I will just make one side note observation. What's one way to spot a generative AI text? You see words like delve, DELVE. Delve is more common with ChatGPT. So, and apparently the reason why delve is kind of common with ChatGPT is ChatGPT is annotated. They have a lot of humans like helping them write, I mean, doing the training or so forth. And most of those are in Nigeria, and Nigerians are more likely to use delve. So ChatGPT output has delve much more frequently than, rest of us using. So just a small sort of side note, anecdotal observation about what happens when we start using these tools, right, in everyday speech. We are reproducing certain patterns, right? It may be a good thing, but it also comes with some amount of, standardization. Translation is a great example. Any machine translation, translation into Spanish, right? Machine translation, I would say image to text, the synthesis, cross fusion, that's also really wonderful with all these ChatGPT types of, right? There's a new novel called We Solve Murders. Oh, ChatGPT to make this sound like English gentleman. Wow, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Yes. So yeah, I hope the chat comments are saved. Someone says, I hope so too. Comments are really great. I don't know if I answered all these comments.
Oh, and I thought maybe where do we go from here? What's the good news? What can we as institutions do to promote responsible use of AI? What should we prioritize in terms of promoting the positive and supporting integrity?
Yeah, I think that one issue is definitely the copyright. Are we unintentionally, when we're using generative AI, is there some problems with the copyright protected intellectual property issues? That's one thing we should all be extra careful. The second would be, I would say, understanding how biases filter through these generative AI models. Are we, taking some unintentional biases? Are they filtering through the AI into our research practices? And that's something we should be specifically self-aware. And of course, generative AI hallucinations. It can just make up stuff. There was an example where I think a judge used ChatGPT to write some decision, and then ChatGPT just generated a lot of fake cases, and it gave like fake references. So at least please do not use ChatGPT to write, judgment on a case or something like that, right? Oh, it was a lawyer. Sorry. Yes, sorry. Yes, the audience is better than me. They're all correcting me in real time. This is lawyer Schwartz. Yes, it's not the judge.
There's been questions at our institutions among research admins about like large proposals. Could you use generative AI for like the boilerplate stuff, the biosketch and that? And I
Yes.
said, I would just warn that better be reviewed, because as someone who has been a grant reviewer, and I'm sure many of ours, if I found any hint of generative AI that was not reviewed and got through, you'd immediately lose credibility. So I'd say you could really don't think, sell yourself short thinking you're going to save time, because in my mind, I would think in most reviewers, you'd completely torpedo the proposal if there's any hint of generative AI in anywhere. And I think that we are ultimately responsible for what we create. You've kind of highlighted that don't just use Gen AI without checking its validity and its soundness.
Yes, absolutely. It's, I think that's the last word on the subject.
We'll give you the last word, but yes, it sounds like you agree, is use with caution. Yeah.
Definitely use it with great caution and very, very responsibly, and be especially mindful of the prejudices that are filtered through the process of training itself. And what are we picking up, about human nature and human behavior? I think that's something that we should be very cautious about. So thank you so much. This is a wonderful audience. I learned a lot from the questions.